Mhm. Hello and welcome everybody to the next English lecture for future from the Johannes Kepler University in Linz. Today I'm happy to welcome again a professor from the Catholic Private University in Linz, Assistant Professor Aloisia Moser. Hello.
Hello.
My name is Martin Hoffmann. I'm a physicist and lecturer at the Johannes Kepler University and active within Scientists for Future Austria, and in the regional group also in Upper Austria. This lecture series is dedicated to cover a lot of different scientific areas in order to show the impact on climate change and offer routes and solutions to achieve a positive influence to our society. Just before we start, a quick reminder about the technical details. As always, there's nothing changed so far, just maybe in English today. Since we are streaming over different platforms, so DorfTV today and Facebook and YouTube as well, we would like to ask you to place questions via this menti.com website with the code you see at the bottom of the video with 45635124, I think. And therefore you can place your questions, and we will have 1 hour presentation with a short public discussion where we will just shortly discuss questions, and then we will switch to Zoom. Anyway, we are in Zoom already, but we open the Zoom room for you as well, and you can join us for a real discussion, and we'll switch off the stream. So there's a lively discussion with video, hopefully, and you can ask the questions in person. So I think everything else you will find in the description. The links are also in the description of the video. And please join the Zoom afterwards. So far, the room is locked during the presentation in order to reduce the influences from outside. Anyway, there could be technical difficulties I had in the beginning, but anyway, I hope now it's fine. And by the way, I would like to emphasize that Scientists for Future is funded only by donations. So also I'm actually applied at the JKU for the lectures itself. But the streaming, what we do here for the public and the video editing and so on is practically extra, and all other stuff we are working with Scientists for Future. So you will find also the link in the description for putting a donation maybe. So, but now we have now all the details, and we will come now to the main point of the lectures today. Our speaker today is working at the Institute for History of Philosophy. And now I have really problems with the words because I'm not using this in my physical day with physics every day. So that's not only the stuff I'm not doing only all the time. So actually, she started her career in Europe and studied in Vienna and Berlin, but stayed then over 10 years in various places in the US. So at the New School for Social Research, the Pratt Institute in Brooklyn, or the University of California. Otherwise, if I say something wrong, please correct me. So this lecture is definitely held in English because it's calling for it. And I'm really looking forward. So since 2014, she's back in Europe and was quickly staying in Vienna and Leipzig. So the later one is really, I know really well because I'm close from the area of Leipzig for originally, and then I just came to Linz. So she came in 2016 as assistant professor to Linz. And today we will enjoy her presentation about vibrant matter and human compost, remaking the connection between human beings, other species, and the Earth with Jane Bennett and Donna Haraway. Please share your screen, and the stage is yours.
Okay, I will share my screen. First of all, hello everyone. No matter where you are, Linz, Vienna, or from farther away, I'm really happy you came. So just have to get this started. Okay, so While in German we distinguish between Natur- und Geisteswissenschaften, intimating that both are sciences, in English we call it natural science and the humanities. However, in both cultures, there is a rift between what is considered natural science and what is considered the humanities. And I will speak today, among other things, about finding a way to mend this rift or gulf, given philosophy has been considered both a science as well as part of the humanities. Before I can do so, however, I must clear the ground a little bit. We must prepare the soil, dig up some dirt to find ourselves able to start or understand anew. Please bear with me at the beginning of this lecture or talk in which I delve into scientific theory and method. I promise it will be worth your while, and we will reap the benefit later when we talk about Jane Bennett and Donna Haraway. In each of my introductory lectures, there will inevitably be a student who asks why we study these old texts when philosophy admits that it has never been able to answer its own questions. Science, on the other hand, seems to be far advanced in having been able to give us answers. For this reason, I would like to begin my talk with the question when and why an answer is considered an answer. What is a truth if it is only true within a given framework? What happens when we find our truth, but they only hold true within certain bounds, which happen to be the bounds that we have determined beforehand? What about the principles we hold to be true to start with, and how can we come by them? This is one of the reasons I have in my work focused on method and theory. I have thought a lot about foolproof structures, theories that must hold true, a priori concepts, anything that can yield a semblance of truth, something to compete with the natural sciences. I've spent years thinking about the thinking of thinking, to be precise, of the act of thinking, and I came to realize that the act of thinking is performative. It does not occur in the void like a mathematical algorithm or a Platonic truth. Which brings us back to Earth and to my current research project in this talk. I want to talk to you today not about theory, but about praxis. I want to talk about how the world is not held together by higher a priori truth or a priori structures of thought, not by an act of thinking, but through the praxis of thinking. This thinking is not thinking the way philosophy has been elaborating it. It is not pure thinking devoid of matter, devoid of sensibility, devoid of us and of the earth, but it is a thinking that is chock full of all of these. The thinking of my talk will be performed in 3 parts. Part 1 follows the philosopher Sanders Peirce and his distinctions between different methods of coming to conclusions in philosophy and science, namely deduction, induction, and abduction. The distinctions will open our conversation about the relationship between the thinker and what she thinks about, subject and object. Also, we will look at what we put at the beginning of our thinking, principles and axioms, and how we gain access to them. Here, we will see that Peirce held over 100 years ago that we are similar to that which we think about, and that this is why we can divine it. After the methodological introduction and Peirce, we will be prepared for Jane Bennett's account of the connection of mind and matter. She describes a vibrancy of matter that shows that matter is not dead or passive, but has force. In the 3rd part, I will introduce Donna Haraway's notion of compost, a notion she uses instead of the notion of the post-human, making the point that humans are humus, just as animals and plants are. The aim of this talk is to show that there is always already a connection between the scientist who investigates to that which she investigates, that it matters in the double sense of the world. We are matter, and how we treat other human beings, animals, plants, and stones matters for us to keep ourselves, our planet, alive. Sanders Peirce. When people quote Peirce, it is mainly in connection with the theory of semiotics or with symbol theory. Well, I mean, not mainly, but often. What I want to underline in today's talk is Peirce's pragmatism. Peirce called his own version of pragmatism, pragmaticism, a pragmatic theory of meaning. Thinking, he was convinced, must justify itself in application practice. Like the later Wittgenstein, Peirce was convinced that the meaning of any verbal expression or visual sign or image could only be completely exhausted or explained within the praxis of its use. When we study nature in our empirical perceptions, we cannot find structures that go beyond what we see and that could include the kinds of rules and conventions for use. How then can we speak about nature if its meaning cannot be exhausted by concepts we gain through empirical investigations? Christian Martin, professor in Heidelberg, made the same point or a similar point in a recent paper that nature is not a concept that can be investigated by natural science, since nature is not an object that could be empirically investigated. Peirce thinks we need to look at the relations between perceptions, convictions, and actions. There is a web of sociocultural practices at work. To understand how a perception becomes a conviction, a truth we hold, we need to look at how we usually act in a successful way. Peirce describes these interrelated connections, or the web in which we perceive, act, and come to convictions within what he calls a logic. Concepts are practical unities of perception, convictions, and our actions. The notion of logic is here taken much wider as it would usually be used. Peirce speaks of logical connections as connected with acts of perception. Experience is looked at as an act of semiosis, of testing out the relation between the signs we use that represent objects and to test whether they really represent objects. We are to imagine an analogy between this and the situation of gaining knowledge in a scientific experiment. Peirce divides reasoning into three classes: deduction, induction, and this is a quote from a late book called The New Elements of Mathematics, quote, and processes of thought capable of producing no conclusion more definite than a conjecture, which I now call abduction, unquote. That's the third kind: deduction, induction, abduction. He then adds that abduction is no more or less than guessing. Peirce counts on the creativity of the everyday, which rests on abduction. Let us have a look at the three forms of conclusion, of which abduction is the creative one. There's a good summary of the distinction between the three forms that I take from a recent publication on Peirce by Christian Ernst. He writes, inductive reasoning rests on a hypothesis that concludes from the individual to the general. Deductive reasoning concludes from the general, which is seen as a rule, to the individual. Finally, Peirce sees abduction as a creative form of conclusion in which we conclude from the singular to the general, but not like an induction in that an individual is made general, but in that we introduce a general in the first place, which could explain the individual. What is crucial here is that deduction needs the general to get started with subsuming individuals under general laws. But how we get to a general in the first place, one that the individual can subsequently be subsumed under, that's the creative form of abduction, says Peirce. Oh, I should have switched to that slide before, I apologize. I'll give you a moment. So Peirce is not shy of admitting that abduction is guesswork. And we should ask, what kind of guesswork? In his late work, Peirce speaks of relations of discovery for abduction and generally as abduction affording us foundations. We can rephrase this in the connection with perception and convictions. We gain our convictions from perceptions which guide our action. At the same time, our perceptions are already informed by hypotheses that rest on the knowledge we gain from experience. That means that the connection between perception, conviction, and action must be interrupted by doubt for us to revise our convictions and come up with new hypotheses through abduction. We can now see that we start with a probing phase of guessing in which we establish presumptions, which are subsequently examined as hypotheses in connection to matters of facts and effects that can be expected, and all in connection with the convictions of a community. This is another quote of Ernst on page 42. He does a really good job summing that up. To engage in the scientific process of testing hypotheses, we therefore need to formulate those hypotheses or general statements in the first place, under which we subsume our scientific findings to come to our conclusions. In a small essay entitled Guessing, Charles Sanders Peirce writes, quote, "The whole noble organism of science has been built up out of propositions which were originally simply guesses," unquote. Peirce goes on to write that what I have already quoted at the start of the talk, that he thinks that, quote, man divines something of the secret principles of the universe because his mind has developed as a part of the universe, unquote. Peirce says that we are part of what we inquire in, and that this is also why we can make guesses to set up the principles or hypotheses of our investigations. This first part of my paper served to establish that our method in the science is dependent on first principles or hypotheses that themselves cannot be found by deduction or induction. The way new hypotheses are found is through abduction, a form of guessing, though Peirce also holds that the way we guess these is not completely in the dark, since our mind has developed as part of the universe. In the following, I want to further engage the claim that our mind is not so different from that which it investigates. Part 2 and 3 of my paper will introduce two contemporary thinkers that also hold that our mind and what we think about are quite alike. Jane Bennett, A Vibrant Matter. Jane Bennett's approach in Vibrant Matter, A Political Ecology of Things, is the topic of the second part of this talk. Bennett argues in her vital materialist view that there being no distinction between thing and person still allows for an anthropomorphic claim. Since we are not radically unlike non-human actants, our point of view can be anthropomorphic, she says. Let us first try to imagine ourselves as creatures that are made of matter the way other things in the world are made of matter. Next, let us try to think of the other things in the world, tables, chairs, trees, etc., as objects that are determined by categories, and ourselves as subjects that can think and determine through categories. I said, try to think, but should it not be try to sense yourself as part of the world of matter, like a link in a chain, not made of a different substance that goes beyond that matter and can think it? And then we try thinking or sensing the other things in the world, tables, chairs, trees, etc., not as mere objects that are passive and determined by thinkers or minds, but let us try to think or sense them as active. This next step is harder. Let us try to think or sense matter as not dead, but as something that is alive. This will be the first step into a new old way of conceiving of the world that Bennett lays out before us. And I say new old because it has always existed. Scientific theories operate based on dualism. The belief is that you can only observe objectively if you believe that you can be detached from that which you observe. What, the monist asks, what if we are not detached? What if we cannot analyze? What if cutting things in pieces to investigate them more closely severs exactly the binds that make them them? Who determines where the proper joints to cut and analyze are, the right distinctions and discriminations to be made, surgical cuts on the one hand and conceptual cuts on the other? Jane Bennett, that was again, the slide came a little bit too late. Another occasion. No. Scientific theories operate based on dualism. The belief is that you can, no, there was, sorry. Here it is. A monist way, one that does not distinguish between objects that are passive and subjects that are active. Monist theories have existed in every period of the history of philosophy, although we seem to be bound to dualism. Scientific theories operate based on dualism. The belief is that you can only observe objectively if you believe that you can be detached from that which you observe. What the monist asks, what if we are not detached? That was the slide I already had. Jane Bennett was born in the United States in 1957. Her 2010 book, Vibrant Matter, is both a philosophical and a political project. Philosophically, she tries to develop further the idea of matter as passive, raw, brutal, and inert, in contrast to the vibrating life to which we and other human beings belong. She talks about the living forces of material formations. She transforms the figures of life and matter and turns them around until she gets an explanation for what she calls vital materiality. The main principle of Bennett's text is that matter, materials, and things are not simply passive raw material, but vital actants. And thus, by vitality, she means, this is the quote on this slide, the capacity of things, edibles, commodities, storms, metals, not only to impede or block the will and design of humans, but also to act as quasi-agents or forces, trajectories, propensities, or tendencies of their own. The effects of things are therefore not simply the effects of things on people, but objects or things as they appear to people. Things are themselves living entities that are not entirely reduced to the contents in which human subjects place them. Everything is also in itself and not just something to us. One could say the thing force is something like a call that emanates from a thing. It calls attention to its singular existence for itself, which goes beyond the relevance for humans. Interestingly, the result of this is that in Bennett's ontology, to be a thing is to have thing power. To be material then means to have the ability to produce affects. Bennett writes, quote, I equate affect with materiality, quote, rather than posit a separate force that can enter and animate a physical body. Here's the unquote. Affect becomes central to politics and ethics in Bennett's work. But her book is about the fact that affects are not specific to human bodies. It's not just about the human body, but about the catalysts that exist in non-human bodies. It is not about superpersonal or intersubjective forces, but about impersonal affects that belong to forms that we cannot imagine as persons. All things for Bennett become mosaic-like assemblies of other bodies. Just as our bodies are assemblies of organs, bones, cells, nerves, a kidney alone is not human. The human body is an assembly of non-human things. To be itself, a thing must interact with other things. Things change when they interact with each other. Bennett's example is that, and it's funny that is really her example, is that when we eat schnitzel with French fries, it turns into our tissue. It changes us physically, enlarging our bodies. For a thing to remain itself, it must constantly invent new ways of interacting with other things so that it does not always, but only sometimes, yield to the modifications that other things insist on. There is apparently not a single purpose, but a swarm of competing purposes pursued simultaneously in each individual, some that are healthy for the whole, and some that are not. This is Bennett reformulation. In this sense, in vital materialism, things and phenomena are contingent, heterogeneous montages or assemblages. For Bennett, the world is not full of ontologically different categories or beings, subjects and objects, but rather of variously assembled materialities that form confederations. Her book is a beautiful account starting with the force of things or thing power as an alternative to how we see objects. The assemblages and their agency help to show that we always work together, humans and non-humans. The term assemblage is borrowed from Deleuze-Guattari. The chapters of her book are enriching. For example, chapter 3 is about edible matter, where she makes the case that edible matter is an actant that operates inside and alongside humankind and exerts influence on our moods and dispositions as well as on our decisions. Bennett aims to defend a conception of self that is impure and a human, non-human assemblage. She also eschews the alternative view that what she calls vibrancy of matter could be attributed to a non-material source like spirit or soul that is added to matter. Okay, now we are sort of switching to yet another account. Donna Haraway's Staying with the Trouble, Making Kin in the Cthulhu. I'm not sure I pronounced that right. It's a complicated word. We'll get to it. My second example is Donna Haraway, who introduces the notion of compost in Staying with the Trouble. Unruhig bleiben, die Verwandtschaft der Arten im Cthulhu is the title of a wonderful translation by Karin Harasser from the Kunst University here in Linz. After Bennett, we can now better understand what Donna Haraway means by compost. We find the term first in her acknowledgements in the book, in which she says that it is, quote, the compost pile of colleagues, students, and friends who have made this book possible, unquote, that was, quote, cooking over many years, unquote. The subtitle of Haraway's book is Making Kin in the Cthulhu, and what she means thereby is that we have to make kin with what we would have considered odd in the past. We need to make collaborations in what she calls hot compost piles. Let me just blow my nose. Sorry about that, but so she wants us to become with each other in the material sense. Alone, she says, we know too much or too little. We need to turn to the senses. And this is where the similarity is with Peirce and also with, so the question is, do we think, do we sense, how do we get to know each other? And turning to the senses means, in Haraway's book, composting in the sense of a material semiotic method, a theory, as she says on page 31, in the mud as model, unquote. But what can she possibly mean? She continues to say that her partner suggested to use compost instead of posthuman or posthumanism, and humusities instead of humanities. Haraway admits that, quote, she jumped into that wormy pile, unquote. She thinks that human as humus has potential because that could help us to, quote, chop and shred human as homo, the detumescing project of a self-making and planet-destroying CEO, unquote. So this is a quote that goes on, and I think no, it's still the quote that's on this slide. Imagine, she says, a conference not on the future of the humanities in the capitalist restructuring university, but instead on the power of the humusities for a habitable multi-species model, unquote. If this sounds strange to you, compost and humus are thus ringing in the new age that does away with the Anthropocene. I think you've heard of the Anthropocene in this ring lecture before, but there is a little explanation. Human, or Homo, is obliterated, and the earth of the Cthulhucene is not autopoietic, but sympoietic. The difference between the closed-off autopoietic world of the Anthropocene and the opened world of the Cthulhucene can best be told by the latter having ubiquitous contact zones that lead us out of the individualism towards the shared earth and Haraway's stories about the children of Compost. I won't have time to go into this, but if you ever get to, your hands on Haraway's book, these Camille stories of the children of Compost are wondrous. They're really quite something, I mean, if your imagination needs a kick, I really, really suggest for you to go there and read it. I mean, maybe with a little introduction, but I was quite taken by those stories. Generally, Donna Haraway begins the introduction of her book, Staying with the Trouble, by thinking about the word trouble or disturbance. It is about troubled, disturbing times in which we live. The task she sees here, however, is also to cause trouble, to stir up effective responses to destructive events, and thereby to calm the troubled waters, to rebuild calm places. It is about being present in the sense of interweaving, quote, us mortal critters with innumerable unfinished configurations of places, times, materials, meanings. Haraway arrives at the Cthulhucene, which has two Greek roots, chthon, earth, and what dwells in or under it, and kainos, something like uncertain affinity, both of them connected, a kind of time and place of learning to lead a responsible life and death together on a damaged earth. Yes, you see why this is the philosophy for the Friday demonstrations. Kin, that is kinship or clan, is a wild category, says Haraway, and in it, many people are grouped together, quasi-tamed. To whom are you responsible? Who lives and dies in this relationship or that? Haraway speaks of many relatives, of the omnipresent figure of the SF. This can mean science fiction. I have another slide here. So the SF is a short form, and I like it because Science for Future fits in there too, right? So what she's doing is basically she's trying to come up with a narrative, fabulous method to go on talking about, the earth and our immersement in it, and that, becomes a figural, one. So SF can mean science fiction, as well as speculative fabulation, or also games with string figures. String figures, many of you know these. These are the games that you play with frets when you're a child, just making different patterns. String figures, but also speculative feminism or science fact or so far until now. The list swirls and meanders through the book in words, in pictures, and aims to interweave the author and the readers in the beings and patterns that are at stake. This is, in a way, how we have to imagine the method. Yeah. Haraway, and this is the quote, generously plucks fibers out of clumped and dense events and practices. She tries to follow the threads and read the traces in such a way that your intricacies and patterns become decisive in how we work on real and specific places, being able to remain restless in real and specific times, unquote. SF is thus a method of tracing. A thread is traced into the darkness, into a dangerous adventure story in which it becomes clearer who lives for the civil cultivation of cross-species justice or dies for it and why. But SF is also the thing in itself, named the pattern namely that pattern and that assembly that demand an answer. So the method and that which the method is about are not quite distinguishable here. And third, SF means passing on and retrieving, making and keeping. SF is a practice and a process, a figure of persistence in the Cthulhucene. Of course, the Cthulhucene replaces the Anthropocene or the Capitalocene. It is the end of the belief in technical solutions, whether secular or religious. Some claim it is already too late, says Haraway, that it would be pointless to do anything more. She replies that this bitter cynicism, this game over attitude, is discouraging and encouraged by various forms of futurism. If only working things can bring about a change, or if only what experts do can solve the problem, then that's true. But life on Earth, is it over? Many experts simply know that the number of people will probably be over 11 billion in the year 2100, and that in 150 years, the world's human population will have increased by 9 billion. The effects of this are dire. Haraway's book wants to be productive. Staying restless means making us related in a stubborn way. It means, quote, that we need each other in unexpected collaborations and combinations, in active composting, unquote. It is this kind of material semiotics that always situates us in a certain place that is interwoven and worldly. Haraway's book is about stories and characters of relatives in the Cthulhucene, so that we can cut the fetters of the Anthropocene and the Capitalocene. So I'm looking at the time. I think I have time left for an example. I admit it is really hard, to basically think or sense oneself there, to step over, the kind of thinking that we're used to, that basically places us out of time and space, somewhere up there, and then makes us look down on the objects and put everything in logical order, in certain kinds of orders. And so this is a philosophy that tries to make experience and sense pivotal to the process of understanding the world we are in. And as you see, understanding becomes a different thing then. It is not simply some thinking that is done in theory, but understanding is a practice, something that's practically, you could say, lived together with, not other human beings, but also other species and, the earth. Well, I give this example of, it's actually a sort of artistic research. An example that Donna Haraway gives in the chapter of a book called Thread Games with Our Comrades. And this is, this image of the thread games, the string figures. String figures are at the center of Haraway's work. In Thread Games with Our Comrades, Haraway describes the Pigeon Block project, which is about remaining restless and about recovery. It is also about human brutality towards pigeons and the damage caused by pigeons. And it is about air pollution, which affects people and non-humans to different degrees in terms of mortality and susceptibility to disease, and in people very differently according to class and ethnicity. Pigeon Block is about environmental justice in California. Beatriz da Costa is the artist who carried out the Pigeon Block project with her students Sina Hasse and Kevin Ponto, and thereby linked SF patterns with many human, animal, and cyborg-like co-designers. Some of you probably remember Haraway's earlier work. So here, we get an example of how this poiesis can work and what the problems are with it, especially from our specific viewpoints and how we look at the world right now. Humans and pigeons were intimately connected through communication technologies. Pigeons have been workers and research subjects at the same time in ornithology and psychology for many decades. The pigeons were now used to collect data that would encourage and knowing action in different areas and practices. So the pigeons should help for us to find things out, and they were used because of their specific abilities as birds that fly in a certain height. Pigeon Block is not a substitute for professional research on air pollution, but it aims to provoke, motivate, reinforce, inspire, and illustrate. So the fixed air pollution monitoring devices are usually installed at points in areas with high traffic. Unfortunately, such monitoring devices must mostly be built in higher regions than those in which people, plants, and animals breathe. So you basically have the research being done and the monitoring systems are put in place, but they're not actually where, at the height where the human beings are or where the traffic is. Carrier pigeons, on the other hand, can continuously and in real time collect data on air pollution in flight, even at critical heights that are not accessible to official instruments or close to the ground. How could birds and humans cooperate? What kind of care or responsibility could such cooperation evoke? A team of artists, researcher, engineers developed the basic technology in 3 months. A backpack for the pigeons, which consisted of a combination element for GPS, GSM, like mobile phone, and antennas, a temperature sensor, a SIM card, interface, and a microcontroller were put together. The pigeons shouldn't be overloaded. It took a year to make the backpack comfortable. Fitting balance training in the dovecote, you must learn a lot about pigeons, and the pigeons had to learn too. They are lively co-producers, says Haraway. Pigeons, artist researchers, had to learn to interact and train together. The teammates mutually empowered each other. Quote, they became something together in a speculative fable, unquote. Another quote is, many test runs and test flights later, the cross-species team was able to pull through the air with thread figures of electronic traces, unquote. There is actually an interesting fact about this specific project, because PETA, the People for Ethical Treatment of Animals, wanted to close down Pigeon Block for abuse of animals. Now you can see how interesting this is, right? Pigeon Block, they claimed, would not have the right to use non-human animals because the project did not even carry out scientifically justified experiments. Now, this is interesting, right? Because PETA has less to say against scientific experiments on animals, but it would pursue one goal. I mean, if you do research on animals and you have a goal like to cure diseases, then it's, but art or this kind of artistic research was seen as trivial, as just a game compared to the serious work on topics such as animal rights or scientific progress. But as you can see, this is about artistic research in the truest sense of the word. I mean, it's like you first have to find the imagination to come up with a framework where you think out an experiment like that, and then you have to, co-train humans and animals to even be able to pull it off. This example from Donna Haraway is meant to illustrate a way of doing science that involves other species and the environment in a way that has not been thought of before. It takes a different kind of hypothesis, a sort of artistic creative idea to get to the preconditions and presuppositions that this kind of research is based upon. And yes, it will yield a different kind of scientific answer than the one that we have received so far in the Anthropocene or Capitalocene, where all interest is the interest of the human being, not of the other species or of the earth. Right. So this is actually where I end. I have a last slide. It's interesting when I hold my lectures, I always speak so much in between because I see the students and I react to them, that I made about as many slides as I would for an hour, and I was much faster. So the aim of this talk was to show that there is always already a connection between the scientist who investigates to that which she investigates, that it matters in the double sense of the world. We are matter, and how we treat other human beings, animals, plants, and stones for us to keep ourselves, our planet alive, matters. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks a lot for the interesting talk. So
let me stop my. Yeah.
Yes, exactly. Thanks. So let's think about some questions. At least there are some questions in Menti and no questions in YouTube, but it's okay. There's practically one maybe important question, but it comes out from your last slide as well. So what has this to do with the environment? So in principle, maybe you can go from the last slide and just make the connection a little bit to the environment and the climate crisis again. So this.
Okay, was that a real question?
Yeah. I just read it.
Okay, well, that's interesting. Okay, so it's funny, you know, at the New School for Social Research, where I was a student, we often had guest speakers, and they would speak and speak, and it was very, you know, hard sometimes to follow. And then there was the discussion afterwards, and with the questions, you know, we often started to understand what the talk was about. I hope this is not really when you find out what my talk was about, but I'm gonna try to make that connection again. So let me say it like this. Maybe I'll use Bruno Latour, a scientist, and a quote of his to make that connection more properly for you. If we think about the Earth in a certain way, so that's what I mean by presuppositions and axioms. If we think that choosing methods in science is a process that's basically a logical operation in our head, then we're going to come out with solutions that are pretty heady, which means that are about the logical connections between this, and this serves this, and this serves this. And what gets left by the wayside is what you just, you know, would call the environment, right? So basically the connections between materialistic, you know, between matter in the world, you know, has been thought by us according to logical principles, and not according to the sorts of entanglements that, you know, let's say human beings who are themselves made of matter have with the Earth. So we've basically thought the Earth as something distinct from us that we can order with our beautiful philosophical principles, and we've not thought the Earth or the world, the environment, as something that is literally part of us. That was the gist of the talk.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thanks. And okay, this will be a long question and certainly a long answer. Is philosophy going to save the world? Well, maybe I would recommend to just join the discussion in Zoom, and then we can elaborate on this question as well.
That's similar to the question that my students ask at the beginning of the lectures. Has philosophy ever answered the question? No, it hasn't. But I think what's important is to ask questions and to ask them anew, which means philosophy is not there for answering questions, but it might be helpful for readjusting, you know, the kind of angle that we're taking at things. And I think right now there's a real, you know, big change in philosophy, which has a very, very strong neo-materialistic current. And neo-materialistic means that matter starts to matter, and you see this word game is actually quite important. So we're talking more about the Earth, about you know, the things we're made of, and less about the categories that we have to talk about them properly. So no, philosophy is not going to save the world. We together, as Donna Haraway said, I think we together must, become in a way that things go on. What we will be is going to be quite, it's going to be weird.
Okay, yeah. This will be a very good ending for the official part and the live stream. So thank you very much again. We will just go for the discussion now. And I will just remind you, the next talk will be on the 31st of May, exactly. And I will be happy if you join again our stream or on Facebook or anything else. And therefore, thank you very much. Thank you much for the talk and see you next time.
Thank you for listening.